Vacation. The dashboard clock read 11:45 p.m. when I first saw them. Two silhouettes against the darkness of Highway 43, illuminated only by my high beams, a teenage boy holding the hand of a small, barefoot girl, both dressed for summer despite December's biting cold. I remember thinking, who would abandon children on this desolate stretch between Querétaro and Guadalajara at midnight? This question has haunted me for years, far more than what happened next. My name is Miguel Reyes. I've been driving for Estrella Dorada bus lines for 15 years, mainly the overnight routes across central Mexico. That December night in 2012 was supposed to be different. My boss, Don Fernando, had lent me one of the company's luxury coaches so I could take my family to Manzanillo for a vacation. 22 relatives were aboard. My wife Elena, our daughters, my mother's siblings, and even my neighbor Carmen, who had nowhere to go for Christmas. My brother Diego, also a driver, would take over halfway to let me rest. We should have left Mexico City by 6:00 p.m., but you know how family is. We waited 3 hours for my sisters and their husbands. By 9:00 p.m., with everyone finally aboard, we departed into the night. Most fell asleep within the first hour, the soft hum of the engine providing a lullaby. I calculated we'd reach our first rest stop around 2:00 a.m., where Diego would take over. The highway stretched before us, empty and still. The moonless night pressed against the windows, making our bus feel like the only illuminated space in a vast darkness. The radio played softly, Vicente Fernandez singing about heartbreak and redemption. I've driven this route hundreds of times, but never had I felt such unease. Perhaps it was the responsibility of carrying my entire family. Or perhaps it was something else, something in the air that night. The temperature had dropped dramatically unusual even for December in the highlands. Frost patterns formed at the edges of the windshield despite the heater running. That's when my headlights caught them standing along a wider section of the shoulder. The boy maybe 16 and the little girl no older than 5 or 6. Their appearance was jarring in its normalcy. The boy in a simple white shirt and pants, the girl in a floral dress. No jackets, no bags, nothing to suggest how they'd arrived there. Most disturbing were their bare feet on the frozen ground. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. This highway segment was completely isolated. No towns for 30 kilometers in either direction, just fields and distant mountains. These children shouldn't be here, couldn't be here. I felt the weight of my family sleeping behind me as I instinctively began to slow down. The children turned toward the approaching lights. The boy raised his hand slightly, not quite a wave more, a gesture of acknowledgement. I had already decided to stop before this silent request. What struck me most were his eyes, far too ancient for his youthful face, as if they had witnessed decades beyond his apparent years. The girl simply stared, her expression a mixture of sadness and resignation that no child should possess. As the bus slowed to a near stop, I heard a voice directly behind my right shoulder. "Don't stop, they're dead." My blood froze. I jerked my head around to see who had spoken, but the first 4 rows of seats were empty. Everyone else was sleeping. The voice had been clear, deep, masculine, familiar in a way I couldn't place. It reminded me of my father, who had died the previous year in a tragic accident on this very highway after 40 years of accident-free driving. Despite the warning, I brought the bus to a complete stop. The screeching brakes woke Elena, who came forward with our youngest daughter, Lucia, who needed to use the bathroom. "What's happening?" Elena asked, confused to find us stopped in the middle of nowhere. "I saw some children back there walking alone along the highway," I explained, no longer feeling the same certainty that had prompted me to stop. We opened the door and peered out into the darkness. The moonless night revealed nothing. Where I had seen the children moments before, there was only empty road stretching back into blackness. "Hello," Elena called out. "Do you need help?" No response came except for the whisper of wind through roadside grass. Meanwhile, Lucia was dancing impatiently between the seats, her need to use the bathroom growing urgent. Elena and I exchanged glances, both feeling a growing unease. We reluctantly stepped off the bus with Lucia. Elena stayed close to the vehicle's light, not wanting to venture far into the darkness. They were only gone for about 5 minutes. As Elena was helping Lucia adjust her pants, we heard two distinct laughs coming from the dry brush beside the highway. A boy's laugh and a girl's, but hollow and echoing, as if emanating from deep within a cave rather than from human throats. Elena snatched Lucia up and we scrambled back onto the bus, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. I slammed the door shut and accelerated, not daring to look back. For the remainder of the journey to Guadalajara, I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead, refusing to glance at the darkness on either side. 6 months later, I encountered an old truck driver at a highway cafe who recognized the haunted look that still occasionally crossed my face. "You've seen them, haven't you? The ghost children of Highway 43 Inches?" he asked without preamble. My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. "How did you know?" He nodded grimly. "That stretch is famous among us old-timers." 10 years ago, a school bus crashed there on a foggy night. Inexperienced driver took a curve too fast. Only 2 survived initially, a 16-year-old boy and his 6-year-old sister. But they didn't make it through the night. Died from hypothermia trying to walk for help. The description matched exactly what I had seen. I felt ill. "Why do they appear to some drivers and not others?" I asked. "Legend says they only show themselves to those who've recently lost someone," he replied. "A kind of test. Those who stop for them never reach their destination." The voice that had warned me, my father's voice. Had he somehow protected us that night 2 years later, I was driving a tour group from America along the same route on a rainy April evening. I hadn't thought about the ghost children in months when a middle-aged woman with glasses suddenly appeared in the passenger seat beside me. "What are those children doing out on the road in this rain?" she asked, pointing ahead. There they were again. The same boy and girl now standing in the middle of the highway, holding hands, staring directly at the oncoming bus. I swerved violently, the bus sliding on the wet pavement. Passengers screamed as I fought to keep the vehicle from plunging into the ditch. Somehow I stabilized it. When I turned to the woman with glasses, the seat was empty. I pulled over, put on the hazard lights, and checked on the passengers. Everyone was frightened but uninjured. But not one of them matched the description of the woman who had spoken to me. "Is there anyone here with short hair, glasses, wearing a blue sweater?" I asked desperately. The tour guide shook her head. "No one like that in our group, Señor Reyes." As I continued driving, strange occurrences multiplied. The radio turned on by itself, cycling through stations until stopping on an old news report about the school bus accident. Even when I unplugged it, the radio continued playing. Passengers complained about unusual cold spots on certain seats despite the heating system working properly. One little girl suddenly asked her mother, "Who are the 2 kids sitting in the back row? Why don't they talk?" When I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart nearly stopped. There they were, the boy and girl in white clothes, sitting in the last row, staring directly at me. When I looked again seconds later, the seats were empty. At the first gas station we reached, I called Elena, desperate to know Lucia was safe. "Miguel, what's wrong? Do you know what time it is?" She answered, her voice thick with sleep. "Are you and Lucia all right?" I asked, voice trembling. "Of course we're fine. We're at your mother's." "Why are you asking?" When I returned to the bus, I found small, wet footprints on the steps, as if someone had just boarded from the rainy night. Walking down the aisle, I stopped at the last row where I'd seen the children. The seats were empty, but the fabric was damp with 2 distinct body-shaped impressions. Under the windshield wiper, I found a small note in childish handwriting. "Save us, we're still there." I researched the school bus accident afterward. It happened exactly as the truck driver had described. A foggy night, an inexperienced driver, 22 students killed. But there were details he hadn't mentioned. According to the investigation, the 2 surviving children, Manuel and Maria Rodriguez, hadn't died from hypothermia. They'd been picked up by another bus that stopped when it saw them waving by the roadside. But that bus never reached the next town. It disappeared along with its driver and the two children. 1 week later, they found the bus at the bottom of a deep ravine about 30 kilometers from the first accident site. The driver's body was in a horrifying condition, as if he'd tried to escape the vehicle as it fell. But the children were never found. Never. I visited the accident site in daylight. There was a small memorial with a cross for the victims. Locals placed flowers and candles, but refused to stay after sundown. An elderly man from a nearby village told me that according to ancient Nahua legend, souls of those who die unexpectedly, especially children, become trapped between worlds. They search for someone like themselves, drivers' children, to guide them home. But the home they seek is not one of the living. If you stop for them, the old man said, you become their replacement. You become the trapped one and they are freed. I no longer drive that highway segment. I quit Estrella Dorada and now drive taxis within the city. But sometimes when I drive at night and glance in my rearview mirror, I still see two young faces looking back at me from the back seat. Last week, my Lucia, now 16, took a school bus to Querétaro. When the bus returned later than expected, I was frantic. When Lucia finally arrived home, I held her tight and asked if the trip had gone well. "Dad, I met the strangest two kids," she said. "They weren't from my school. They appeared when our bus broke down. They said they knew you. They said you tried to help them once." My heart froze. What did you tell them?" Lucia smiled, but there was something wrong with her smile, not the one I knew. "I told them to wait, that you'd come back for them. You promised, didn't you?" Her eyes bored into me, eyes that no longer belonged to my daughter. "When I drive at night now, I always take a different route home. I always check the back seat before getting in, and I never ever stop for anyone standing along the highway after dark, no matter how much they might need my help, because sometimes what waits by the roadside isn't looking for a ride, it's looking for a replacement." Route 260. Nobody wants to drive Route 260. Eduardo Vega sighed, staring at the assignment board at Intermex Bus Company's terminal. His name appeared once again next to that dreaded number 260, Eduardo Voix 2200. 3 consecutive weeks now he'd been assigned the night run on the notoriously isolated and dangerous route. This was punishment from dispatcher Ortega after their argument about overtime pay. Eduardo had complained about reduced hours, and Ortega had found the most elegant revenge possible, Route 260. Why did drivers avoid Route 260? Eduardo knew well, as did every driver at Intermex. The route passed through remote hill country with 260 kilometers of minimal lighting, few rest stops, and virtually no cell signal. But those weren't the reasons drivers feared it. It was the stories about what happened on Route 260, especially after midnight. Eduardo collected the keys from security and walked to the parking lot. Bus hash 23, a used 2008 Volvo B7R with 500,000 kilometers on the odometer, awaited him. Not the best in the company fleet, but at least the air conditioning worked and the seats were decent. He performed a thorough check oil, water, tires, lights before driving to the boarding gate. At 21:45, passengers began lining up with suitcases and bags. Eduardo counted 37 people, a full bus. Not bad for a Tuesday night. Eduardo wasn't superstitious. He'd driven buses for 12 years, traversing every corner of Mexico from northern deserts to southern rainforests. He'd driven through storms, along treacherous mountain roads, even through areas with gang activity. But Route 260 felt different. Perhaps because Mateo, his best friend and colleague, had changed completely after a trip on Route 268 months ago. Mateo had been cheerful, a joke teller, always ready to help. But after that night he became withdrawn, distant, and 2 weeks later quit without explanation. The last time Eduardo saw Mateo, his friend only said, "If they assign you Route 260, call in sick." Now, watching passengers board, Eduardo wondered if he should have heeded that advice. But he needed this job. With 3 young children and a mortgage, he couldn't risk dismissal for unjustified absence. At precisely 22:00, the bus departed. The engine's steady rumble provided a reassuring familiarity. Just a normal night run, Eduardo told himself. There and back like always. The first 2 hours passed smoothly. They left the city, passed through suburbs, then into vast agricultural fields. The night sky was clear, thousands of stars twinkling like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Eduardo played a comedy film on the small, ceiling-mounted screens, and occasional laughter from passengers created a comfortable atmosphere. By 23:30, the movie ended. Eduardo didn't start another ahead lay winding mountain roads requiring his full concentration. Most passengers were asleep, the bus quiet, except for the engine's hum and the sound of tires on pavement. That's when, as they entered the most isolated stretch of the journey, Eduardo noticed a passenger approaching the driver's seat. A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, wearing a light blue blouse and jeans. Her long black hair cascaded over her shoulders. Eduardo didn't remember seeing her during ticket inspection, but with 37 passengers, he couldn't recall every face. The young woman stood beside him. In the cabin's darkness, her face was only dimly illuminated by the dashboard lights and occasional flashes from reflective road markers. "Could you stop the bus? I need to get off," the woman said, her voice soft, yet determined. Eduardo glanced at her, then returned his focus to the road. "We don't have a stop here, miss. The next stop is still 45 minutes away." But as he heard her voice, Eduardo felt a strange sensation. That voice was hauntingly familiar. It sounded exactly like Claudia, his sister, who had died in a motorcycle accident 5 years ago. A chill ran down Eduardo's spine. He checked the time, 23:45 p.m. They were in the worst section of Route 260, dense forest, on both sides tall trees forming a natural tunnel of darkness. The bus headlights couldn't penetrate the thick darkness flanking the road. "I need to get off right now," the woman insisted, her voice still gentle but more resolute. "I can't stop here," Eduardo explained, trying to keep his voice steady despite his racing heart. "This isn't a safe area. There's nothing here, no houses, no lights, no rest stops. You'd be lost if you got off here." The woman didn't respond, but Eduardo could sense her staring at him. Her breathing was heavy and hurried, as if suppressing great desperation. Eduardo glanced in the rearview mirror. Most passengers remained asleep. A few awake ones wore headphones or gazed out windows, oblivious to his conversation with the woman. Suddenly an image flashed in Eduardo's mind. Claudia, his sister, wearing the outfit she had on the day of her accident. A light blue blouse and jeans. Identical to what this woman was wearing. "You'll miss where I need to go," the woman said, her voice now pleading. "I need to get off here. This is where I belong." Eduardo felt goosebumps spreading across his body. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, focusing on the road ahead. "I cannot stop the bus. That's company policy. If there's an emergency, we can stop at the next gas station." The woman didn't reply. She stood there, silent, breathing heavily. Eduardo could feel her eyes on him, but dared not look over. After about a minute of tense silence, the woman suddenly reached toward the steering wheel. Eduardo wasn't sure what she intended, perhaps to grab the wheel and force the bus to stop, but his instincts reacted. He hit the brakes, activated the hazard lights, and steered to the roadside, careful not to hit the tall trees flanking the road. The brakes screeched loudly, waking many passengers. Murmurs and complaints rose from behind as the bus came to an abrupt halt. Eduardo opened the door, uncertain what he was doing. Cold air rushed into the cabin, causing many to shiver. The automatic light illuminated the exit area, casting an eerie blue glow on the steps. The woman descended slowly, saying nothing, not looking back. When both feet touched the overgrown grass beside the highway, she walked into the forest darkness. No thank you, no nod, she vanished into the thick shadows. Eduardo stood watching the spot where she disappeared, an icy chill crawling up his spine. A passenger, a middle-aged man with glasses, approached the front. "What's happening? Why did we stop?" he asked. Eduardo stammered, A passenger wanted to get off." The man looked around, puzzled. "Here in the middle of the night in the forest?" He shook his head in disbelief. "That's crazy." Eduardo returned to the driver's seat, feeling his hands tremble. He closed the door, turned off the hazard lights, and prepared to continue. Before doing so, he turned to survey the entire bus, counting every row, every face. Every seat was occupied. If the woman had truly been a passenger, there should be an empty seat. But there wasn't. Everyone remained seated, some sleeping, others watching him with annoyance for being awakened. Eduardo's heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. He placed his hands on the steering wheel, trying to steady himself, and resumed driving. He needed to leave this place as soon as possible. But he couldn't stop thinking about the woman with the voice like his sister's, about how no seat was empty, about the stories other drivers whispered about Route 260. They were approaching kilometer marker 260, the point the route was named after. Eduardo checked the time, 23:57 p.m., 3 minutes until midnight. Though not superstitious, he couldn't help thinking about all the ghost stories referencing the witching hour, as his grandmother called it. He focused on driving, staring intently at the road illuminated by headlights. The kilometer markers appeared sequentially: 257, 258, 259. Eduardo felt cold sweat trickling down his back. His heart beat faster as the bus approached the next marker. He didn't want to look, but his eyes automatically scanned the sign as it came into view: kilometer 260. At that moment, Eduardo saw a figure standing beside the road right under the marker. A woman in a familiar outfit, light blue blouse and jeans. But this time, when the headlights illuminated her face, Eduardo saw clearly it wasn't the strange woman who had exited his bus minutes earlier. It was Claudia, his dead sister, no doubt whatsoever. The familiar face he had missed every day for 5 years. The slight smile, the large round eyes, the small scar on her chin from when she fell off her bike at age 8. Around Claudia was a pale blue light similar to the bus exit light. It formed a hazy aura around her, making her figure seem suspended between reality and dream. Eduardo screamed, hitting the brakes hard again. The bus skidded on the road surface, passengers shouting in panic. When the vehicle stopped completely, Eduardo opened the door and ran outside, ignoring the complaints behind him. He ran to kilometer marker 260, but no one was there. Claudia had vanished. "Claudia!" Eduardo shouted into the darkness. "Claudia, where are you?" Only his echo answered, along with insect sounds and wind rustling through trees. The passenger with glasses had followed Eduardo outside and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Friend, are you okay? What did you see?" Eduardo turned to look at the man, then back at the bus with hazard lights blinking. Passengers were gathering at the door, looking out with concern and fear. I thought I saw someone on the road," Eduardo stammered. "A woman." The man looked around, then shook his head. "There's nobody here, friend. We're in the middle of the forest, 30 kilometers from the nearest town. Nobody walks here at night." Eduardo knew the man was right, but he also knew what he'd seen. It was Claudia, without question. When they returned to the bus, Eduardo heard a passenger telling another, "That's why they call it Route 260. Because at kilometer 260 people see their dead relatives." Eduardo froze. What did you just say?" The passenger, an elderly man with a silver beard, looked at him with pity. "You didn't know? All drivers know about Route 260. That's why nobody wants to drive it." "Know what?" Eduardo asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. The old man sighed. "Route 260 passes through an ancient forest. The Nawa believe it's where the boundary between the world of the living and the dead is thinnest, At kilometer 260, sometimes people see their deceased loved ones. But, Eduardo pointed toward the forest, she got on our bus. She asked to be let off here. Who got on our bus? The old man asked, looking confused. Nobody got off. We only stopped because you slammed on the brakes suddenly. Eduardo looked around the bus. Everyone was staring at him as if he'd lost his mind. How many drivers have you been on this route? The old man asked. I don't understand, Eduardo said. I've taken this route many times, the old man explained. Most drivers experience something at kilometer 260. Some see their deceased relatives by the roadside. Some hear voices. And some... He paused, looking at Eduardo with a grave expression. Some talk to passengers who don't exist. Eduardo felt as if the floor were collapsing beneath his feet. He staggered back to the driver's seat, his mind spinning. Perhaps I should drive the rest of the way, the man with glasses offered. I have a bus license. You're not in condition to drive right now. Eduardo was too shaken to protest. He nodded, yielding the driver's seat, and sat in an empty seat in the first row. As the bus continued its journey, Eduardo couldn't stop thinking about Claudia, about the mysterious woman with his sister's voice, and about this cursed Route 260. A month after the incident at kilometer 260, Eduardo still hadn't returned to work. He had taken medical leave, spending time with his family and trying to forget what had happened that night. But he couldn't forget. The image of Claudia standing under kilometer marker 260, surrounded by that blue halo, haunted him every night. Finally, Eduardo decided to seek answers. He drove to a small village near Route 260 where the Nahua people still maintained many ancient traditions. There he met a curandero, a traditional healer named Don Esteban. The old man listened to Eduardo's story without interruption. When Eduardo finished, Don Esteban nodded as if already knowing everything. Route 260 passes through the Valley of Souls, the old man explained. In our tradition, that is where the souls of those who died untimely deaths gather. They are trapped between this world and the next. But why did I see my sister? Eduardo asked. And who was the woman who boarded my bus? Don Esteban poured Eduardo a cup of strong herbal tea. Your sister's soul cannot continue its journey. She is stuck, and she was searching for you, the only relative who could help her. Help her how? Take her home. Don Esteban looked deeply into Eduardo's eyes. But not your home. Her home now is the next world. And to reach it, she needed you to take her to kilometer 260. But I did that, Eduardo protested. I stopped the bus for that woman. Don Esteban shook his head. That woman wasn't your sister. She was another soul also trapped, also seeking a way home. But Claudia is still waiting for you. Eduardo felt a chill run down his spine. You mean I have to go back there? I have to go back to Route 260 inches. If you want to help your sister find peace, yes. Don Esteban sipped his tea. But be careful. The Valley of Souls is filled with other spirits also wanting release. They will do anything, say anything to get your help. You must help only your sister. How will I know it's truly Claudia? Eduardo asked, his voice trembling. Don Esteban pulled from his pocket a necklace made of green jade. Wear this. It will help you see the truth. A week later, Eduardo drove his personal vehicle to Route 260. He had resigned from Intermex, deciding that after tonight, he would never drive this road again. The sun was setting when Eduardo approached kilometer 260. He parked by the roadside, put on the jade necklace Don Esteban had given him, and waited. Darkness fell quickly in the forest. The sounds of insects and night animals surrounded him, creating an eerie symphony in the shadows. The clock struck 23:57 p.m., the same time he had seen Claudia a month earlier. He stepped out of his car, stood beside kilometer marker 260, and waited. From the forest darkness, Eduardo saw a figure approaching. His heart raced as he recognized Claudia in her familiar outfit and with that pale blue aura surrounding her. "Eduardo!" she called his name, her voice echoing as if from somewhere far away. "You came back!" "Claudia!" Eduardo responded, tears welling up. "You're really here!" "I've been waiting for you," Claudia said, coming closer. "I cannot move on without your help." Eduardo reached out his hand, but stopped when he remembered Don Esteban's warning. He touched the jade necklace, and then he saw Claudia's eyes weren't the warm brown he remembered, but completely black without whites. Her hands weren't human hands, but long, sharp claws, and her smile, too wide, too many teeth. "You're not Claudia." Eduardo backed away, trembling. The creature paused, the smile vanishing. "Of course I am, brother. I'm your Claudia." "No," Eduardo shook his head. "I can see what you truly are. And you are not Claudia." The creature growled, its voice now distorted, no longer resembling Claudia's. "I need a living soul to replace me. You came back. You returned voluntarily. You are mine." Eduardo retreated toward his car, but the creature moved with impossible speed, blocking his path. At that moment, Eduardo heard another voice from across the road, a soft, familiar voice. "Eduardo, don't listen to it." Eduardo turned and saw the real Claudia, his sister, standing on the other side of the road. No blue halo, no black eyes, just Claudia, as he remembered, warm, gentle, with a sad smile. "Claudia," Eduardo whispered. "I'm sorry, brother," the real Claudia said. "I shouldn't have let you come back here, but I couldn't move on without saying goodbye." "Do you need my help?" Eduardo asked, tears streaming down his face. Claudia smiled sadly. "No, I just need you to live your life. Don't let grief for me hold you back. I'm ready to move on, but I need to know you are too." The imposter creature roared in anger, lunging toward Eduardo, but when it touched the jade necklace, it screamed in pain and recoiled. "Promise me," the real Claudia said. "Promise that you'll live a full life. Tell your children about their Aunt Claudia. Don't forget me, but don't live in the past either." Eduardo nodded, too emotional to speak. "I have to go now," Claudia said, her form beginning to fade. "I love you, Eduardo." "I love you too, sister," Eduardo replied through tears. Claudia smiled one last time, then dissolved into the air. The creature impersonating Claudia also disappeared, emitting a final angry growl before retreating into the forest darkness. Eduardo stood there for a long time, looking at the spot where the real Claudia had stood. Then he returned to his car, his heart heavy, but also relieved in a way. As he started the engine and began to drive away, Eduardo realized something. Not only had Claudia been freed from the boundary between worlds, he had too. As Eduardo drove past kilometer 260, for the final time the radio turned on, although he hadn't touched it. Through the static he heard a woman's voice, not Claudia's, but an old raspy one. "Route 260 always seeks new drivers, those who have lost loved ones, those who carry regret. Tonight you escaped, but we will wait. We always wait." Eduardo switched off the radio, hands shaking. He drove straight through the night, not stopping until he reached the city limits and the safety of street lights and people. That night, as he prepared for bed, he heard a gentle tap on his bedroom window. Looking out, he saw a hawk perched on the sill, a rare sight in this urban area. The hawk's eyes contained an intelligence and awareness beyond any normal animal's. It tilted its head as if assessing Eduardo, then nodded almost imperceptibly. And in that moment, Eduardo felt something awaken within him, an ancient connection to the land his ancestors had called home, a heritage he didn't know he possessed. "I will come," he whispered to the hawk, "on the full moon." The hawk spread its wings and flew away, disappearing into the night. But Eduardo knew this was only the beginning. The guardians were calling him, and he could not refuse the invitation. As Eduardo finally drifted to sleep, he dreamed of running through the forest on 4 legs, his silver-gray fur gleaming in the moonlight, and the call of Tepeyolotl, the heart of the mountain, echoing in his mind. In the dream, Eduardo finally understood why he had always felt watched whenever he drove that road, not because he was being observed by the Nahuales, but because he was one of them. "The Watchers. Late again," Hector Martinez muttered, glancing at the tiny digital clock taped to his bus dashboard. The blue-tinted screen displayed 11:50 p.m. He should have been 20 kilometers further down the road by now, according to his regular schedule. 20 years driving the Mexico 81 route through the Las Aguilas mining region had given Hector a precise internal map of where he should be at any given time. The ancient Casio watch without its wristband had become a trusted companion on these lonely night journeys. Nowadays, everyone had mobile phones, but that meant nothing on this stretch, no signal, no connectivity. The watch remained his only timekeeper. When it beeped to signal midnight, Hector knew he was significantly behind schedule. He couldn't remember exactly why. Perhaps passengers lingered too long at the dinner stop, or maybe they'd been stuck behind a slow-moving ore convoy earlier. Hector glanced in the rear-view mirror. Most passengers were asleep exhausted after a long day of travel. Only one young woman remained awake, clutching her backpack as if it contained her entire life. Her face was tense, eyes repeatedly checking her wristwatch. She was clearly the only one in a hurry among the passengers. "Our bus service doesn't even reach 2 stars, Hector thought bitterly. The Líneas del Norte company operated a small fleet of old buses discarded by larger companies, and breakdowns were not uncommon. When hired as a driver here, one unwritten requirement was basic mechanical knowledge. "You need to be a mechanic if you want to drive buses on this route," his boss had told Hector on his first day. Now he understood why. As if to prove this point, just as the clock struck midnight, the clutch pedal suddenly sank to the floor. The bus continued rolling for several dozen meters before Hector decided to stop completely. He steered to the roadside, turned off the engine, and sighed. The Las Aguilas Mountains were famous for copper and silver mining operations dating back to colonial times. Barren hills flanked both sides of the road like gigantic shadows in the night. In the distance, weak lights from an active mine twinkled like faint stars on the ground. This road segment rarely saw traffic at night except for ore trucks and buses like Hector's. "What's wrong?" The woman with the backpack had stood up and approached Hector. Her voice woke a few passengers in the front rows. "Seems like an issue with the clutch system," Hector explained, trying to maintain a calm, professional tone. "I need to check. It will take a little time." Within 10 minutes, Hector was lying beneath the bus, a small flashlight clenched between his teeth, his hands covered in grease as he tried to identify the problem. The moon had set, leaving only a faint yellowish glow on the horizon, with just the bus headlights illuminating the surrounding area. The night air was bitterly cold, causing passengers who had stepped outside to stamp their feet and rub their hands for warmth. Some had returned to the bus to escape the chill. Hector felt the pressure. He knew these people were counting on him to get them safely to Matamoros, however delayed. From his position under the chassis, Hector looked up at the night sky. With no moonlight or streetlights, just millions of stars twinkling against the inky blackness. In that moment, he felt incredibly small and alone amid the vast, wild landscape. Suddenly, a dust cloud swirled up from across the road, dragging along pebbles and dry leaves. Hector found this strange. There were no vehicles nearby to create such a wind current. The thick dust quickly engulfed the road, then slammed into the left side of the bus with a dull, thudding sound. The dust was so dense that visibility dropped to just a few meters. The howling wind outside drowned out even the idling engine noise. Hector hastily crawled out from under the bus, brushing dust from his clothes, trying to see what was happening. Suddenly, terrified screams erupted. Hector saw passengers running in various directions, some scrambling back onto the bus, making it rock violently, others darting across the road without looking either way. They ran, as if being chased by something terrifying. "What's happening? What is it?" Hector called out, but his voice was swallowed in the chaos. He couldn't see their faces, couldn't understand what was occurring, but clearly something had frightened them to their core. As the dust began settling, Hector made his way back to the front of the bus. What he saw froze the blood in his veins. Standing on the road about 10 meters from the bus were two men and a large animal. Initially, Hector thought it was a dog, but looking closer, he realized it was a wolf, a massive gray wolf standing as high as a man's hip. Dust still clung to their bodies, floating around them like an ethereal mist. The two men had rough, hardened faces with sharp features and eyes that reflected light like animals in the darkness. They wore simple clothing, white shirts and rough pants, but they appeared old-fashioned and outdated as if from another era. Hector scanned right and left. In the shadows of the hillsides and brush, he saw more figures, men, women, and additional animals of unusual size. A bear stood on its hind legs, taller than any bear Hector had ever seen. A black jaguar with solid black fur instead of the typical spotted pattern. An eagle with a wingspan that must have been 3 meters across. All of them seemed to have emerged from the earth itself, from the brush, from the darkness. They stood in silence, observing. No growls, no threats, just a commanding presence and an unwavering, unblinking gaze. If he were being honest, Hector had to admit that these creatures didn't appear intent on attacking. They were watching like forest guardians or protective deities of this wild mountain region. Since childhood, Hector had heard stories about Nahuales, shapeshifters from ancient Mexican legend. The Nahua people, his ancestors believed certain individuals were born with the magical ability to transform into their guardian animal. But those were just folk tales his grandmother told around the fire, not something standing before his eyes right now. And yet, these beings had something otherworldly about them. They carried an ancient energy, a dignity Hector couldn't explain. The dust still hovered around them as if they weren't fully part of the material world. Nahuales, Hector whispered the word, escaping his lips before his conscious mind could stop it. The massive gray wolf turned its head toward Hector, its amber eyes burning like two small flames in the darkness. It didn't growl or bare its teeth, it simply looked at him with an intelligence far too human in its gaze. One of the men, tall and thin with long silver hair, stepped toward Hector. Each footstep seemed weightless, leaving no impression on the dust-covered road. Hector stood paralyzed, too, afraid to run, too afraid to shout. The man stopped about 2 meters from him, his aged but powerful face reflecting the light from the bus. "Ustedes no pertenecen aquí," the man said in an ancient Nahuatl dialect mixed with Spanish. "You do not belong here." Then he continued, his voice deep like distant thunder. "Las minas sangran la tierra, despiertan lo que debe dormir." The mines, they make the earth bleed, they awaken what should sleep. Hector swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. We're just passing through. We don't mean to trespass." The man regarded Hector for a long moment, as if judging the truthfulness of his words. Then he nodded almost imperceptibly. "Pasen, pero con respeto." Pass through, but with respect. Hector nodded quickly. "Sí con respeto, gracias." The man turned away, walking back to his position beside the wolf. The dust swirled up again, blowing through the area, but gentler this time. Hector didn't need further invitation. He hastily climbed back onto the bus, checking that all passengers had returned. To his relief, everyone was aboard, though many were still trembling with fear. "I've fixed it," Hector announced, knowing it was a lie but not caring. "We can continue." He prayed silently as he turned the key. The engine coughed briefly, then started. The clutch pedal seemed to be working again, though Hector didn't understand why. He didn't question this small miracle, just grateful they could leave. As the bus rolled away, Hector couldn't help glancing in the rearview mirror. The Nahuales still stood there, watching them depart, their eyes reflecting the tail lights like dozens of red fireflies in the darkness. 1 week after the strange encounter, Hector still hadn't told anyone about what he'd witnessed. Who would believe him? Ancient shapeshifters emerging from the earth in the middle of the night on a deserted road. He'd be considered insane or worse, drunk on duty. But Hector knew what he'd seen, and today he had to drive that same road again. His colleague Javier noticed the tension on Hector's face as they shared coffee before the trip. "What's wrong, hombre? You look like you've seen a ghost," Javier joked. Hector tried to smile. "Just didn't sleep well last night." Javier studied him carefully. "Tonight is the Mexico 81 route, right through Las Aguilas." Hector nodded. "You know," Javier lowered his voice, "there are strange stories about that stretch of road. I've heard some of the older drivers talk." Hector felt his heart quicken. "What stories?" "They say the Las Aguilas region is sacred land to the ancient Nahua, that it has protectors, ancient spirits guarding the forests and mines." Javier shook his head. "Just superstition, of course. But I know a few drivers who've refused night runs on that route." Hector felt his throat go dry. Have you ever seen anything strange on that road?" Javier shrugged. "Not exactly. Sometimes a feeling of being watched. And once I swear I saw a giant human shadow standing on a hilltop. But it was probably just my tired eyes." He placed a hand on Hector's shoulder. "Don't worry. Just drive carefully and respectfully. The old folks say the guardians only harm those who trespass or disrespect the land." Javier's words didn't help Hector feel better. All day he couldn't stop thinking about the night journey ahead. He even considered calling in sick, but he needed the money, and this driving job was his only income. As the sun set and Hector collected the bus keys, he noticed his hands trembling slightly. He told himself everything would be fine. Perhaps it was an isolated incident. Perhaps the Nahuales wouldn't appear again. The journey began normally. Hector picked up passengers' checked tickets and departed on time. Tonight there were fewer passengers, only 24 on the 45-seat bus. That meant fewer tips, but at least the bus was lighter, so the engine wouldn't strain as much on the hills. As they left the city and entered rural areas, Hector turned on the radio for company. Local radio stations gradually faded to static as they traveled deeper into the mountains. Finally he turned it off, accepting the silence. Hector checked the time, 10:35 p.m. About an hour until they would reach the section where he had encountered the Nahuales the previous week. His stomach knotted at the thought. They stopped at a small gas station for a rest break. While passengers bought snacks and drinks, Hector approached an old man sitting on a wooden bench outside the store. The man looked local with sun-darkened skin and a face lined like a time map. "Excuse me, senor," Hector initiated. "Could you tell me about Las Aguilas, about the—" "Protectors there." The old man regarded him with sharp black eyes. "You've seen them, haven't you?" It wasn't a question. Hector nodded, his throat tightening. The old man sighed. "They are Nahuales, the shapeshifters, spirits of ancient chiefs and warriors who swore to protect this sacred land from invaders." "But I'm not an invader," Hector protested. "No," the old man nodded, "but the mines are. They dig deep into the earth, breaking places where our ancestors buried their secrets. The Nahuales are angry." Hector felt a shiver run down his spine. "Are they dangerous?" The old man gazed distantly into the darkness. "Not to those who respect the land. Pass through quietly. Don't honk, don't play loud music, don't litter. And if you encounter them—" The old man lowered his voice to a whisper. "Never, never look directly into the eyes of the lead animal, the gray wolf. That is Tepeolotl, the heart of the mountain. Looking directly into his eyes is a challenge." Hector nodded, memorizing the advice. "Thank you, senor." The old man nodded, then took from around his neck a small pendant, a piece of green jade carved into the shape of an eagle. "Take this. It will show them you are a friend, not an enemy." Hector hesitantly accepted the gift. I have nothing to give in return." The old man smiled. "No need. Just remember to respect the land. And when passing through, whisper Tepeolotl, permit me to pass. They will understand." Hector put on the jade pendant, feeling the cool stone against his skin. "Thank you." As they continued their journey, Hector felt slightly more reassured. The jade pendant felt like a protective talisman, and the old man's advice had given him a plan of action. But as they approached Las Aguilas, fear returned. The night sky was now obscured by thick, dark clouds without a single star visible. Wind began rising, blowing dust and dry leaves across the road. Hector checked the time again. 11:45 p.m. They were almost there. As the bus began climbing a long slope, Hector felt the engine working harder. He downshifted, but the bus still grumbled in protest. Then a loud clunk sounded from the engine, and the bus began losing momentum. "No, no, no," Hector muttered, pressing the clutch and trying to shift gears. But it was useless. They were losing power, and there was no choice but to stop, exactly at the same spot as they had stopped the previous week. Hector turned off the engine and sighed. He switched on the microphone to announce, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a small problem with the engine. I need to check. Please remain on the bus and stay calm." He took his flashlight and toolkit, then stepped down to examine the engine. When he opened the hood, a sudden strong gust of wind blew his hat away and extinguished the flashlight. "Great," Hector mumbled, trying to relight the flashlight. When it came back on, he aimed it at the engine and identified the problem: the timing belt had snapped. This wasn't a simple roadside repair. They would need a tow truck, but there was no phone signal here. At that moment, Hector felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. An overwhelming sensation that he was being watched flooded his mind. He slowly turned around. Standing on the road about 20 meters from the bus was a line of nahuales, more than he'd seen last time. At least 20 figures, half human, half animal, all dusted with earth as if they had just emerged from the ground. At the center, tall and majestic, stood the gray wolf Tepeolotl, the heart of the mountain, according to the old man. Beside it was the silver-haired man Hector had met the previous week. Hector remembered the advice. Don't look directly into the wolf's eyes. Respect the land. He bowed his head in reverence and whispered, "Tepeolotl, permit me to pass." A moment of silence passed. Then Hector heard an indistinct sound like stones moving beneath the earth. The road surface trembled slightly under his feet. When he looked up, the gray wolf was approaching him, each step slow and deliberate. Hector stood still, his heart pounding in his chest, but he knew running would only make things worse. The wolf stopped 1 meter from him, standing as high as Hector's chest. From this distance he could see that its fur wasn't entirely material. It fluctuated between solid and ethereal, more like thick fog than animal hair. Tepeolotl regarded Hector, but following the advice, he didn't look directly into the creature's eyes. Instead, he looked down at the jade pendant, which now emitted a faint green glow in the darkness. The wolf emitted a soft growl, not a threatening sound, but more like a greeting. Then it turned its head toward the open hood of the bus. Hector understood the meaning. "Yes, we've broken down. The timing belt has snapped. We cannot continue without repairs." The wolf looked back at him, then toward the road ahead. It growled again, louder this time, like a command. From the forest shadows a figure emerged, an older man, not one of the nahuales, but a real human. He wore the clothes of a mechanic with a toolbox in hand. "I heard your engine," the man said in Spanish as he approached. "Having trouble?" Hector looked from the man to the wolf, then back again. The mechanic seemed unable to see the nahuales, although they stood right there on the same road. "Timing belt," Hector said, his voice slightly shaking. "It's broken." "A common problem with these old buses," the mechanic nodded. "Fortunately, I have a replacement in my toolbox. On my way to the mine to fix an excavator, but I can spare 30 minutes to help you." Hector could hardly believe his luck. A mechanic with exactly the right part appearing in the middle of the night on a deserted road. It seemed almost impossible. But when he glanced toward the wolf, it had retreated, returning to its position with the other nahuales. They appeared to be fading into the darkness, returning to the earth and rock from which they had emerged. The mechanic had already begun working on the engine, whistling a cheerful tune as if he were fixing a car in broad daylight at a regular garage, not in the middle of the night on a supposedly cursed road. "Don't you see anything?" Hector couldn't help asking, pointing toward where the Nahuales stood. "See what?" The mechanic looked up, squinting into the darkness. "Oh, foxes. Yes, there are many foxes in this area. Don't worry, they won't harm you." Hector nodded, realizing this man couldn't see what he was seeing. Or perhaps he chose not to see. Over the next 20 minutes, the mechanic replaced the timing belt with remarkable efficiency and professionalism. When the job was completed, he closed the hood and wiped his hands on a rag. "There now, you can continue. It will get you safely to Matamoros." "I don't know how to thank you enough," Hector said, reaching for his wallet. "How much do I owe you?" The mechanic shook his head. "Nothing. Consider it a favor between travelers on this road." "At least let me know your name," Hector insisted. The mechanic smiled an odd smile, almost knowing too much. "Miguel. My name is Miguel." With that, he turned and walked toward the forest darkness where Hector hadn't seen any vehicle parked. "Wait, how did you get here?" Hector called after him. "Where's your car?" But Miguel had already disappeared into the darkness, as if he had never been there. Hector felt another chill run down his spine. He turned back to look toward where the Nahuales had stood, but they too had vanished. Only a small dust cloud settling on the road remained. When Hector returned to the bus, the jade pendant had stopped glowing, but he could feel it warm against his skin, a reminder that what he had experienced was real. "Are you all right?" Hector's 15-year-old son Carlos asked one evening as they sat beside a campfire during a weekend camping trip. Carlos, now a typical teenager, shrugged in characteristic adolescent fashion. "Those are just fairy tales, right, Dad, like El Chupacabra or La Llorona?" Hector smiled, turning the jade pendant between his fingers. 5 years had passed since that strange night on the Mexico 81 route. 5 years since he had encountered the guardians of Las Aguilas. "More than stories," Hector said softly. "Our ancestors believed that certain people were born with the ability to connect with their spirit animals. In times of need, they could borrow these creatures' forms." "To do what?" Carlos asked, though his expression remained skeptical. There was a spark of curiosity in his eyes. "To protect," Hector answered. "To guard sacred places. To maintain balance between the natural world and the human world." He paused, gazing into the dancing flames. "And sometimes to remind us that there are things beyond our understanding." Carlos rolled a small stone between his fingers. "Dad, have you ever seen a Nahual?" Hector looked at his son, considering his answer. Should he tell the truth, or let the boy maintain his innocent worldview a little longer? "There was a time," he finally said, "when I passed through a very ancient forest where the boundaries between worlds were thin. And," Carlos asked, his voice more eager, "and I learned that there are still forces guarding our last wild places, ancient souls that refuse to be forgotten." Hector pointed to the dark mountains surrounding their campsite. "They're watching us right now." Carlos snorted. "Are you trying to scare me?" Hector laughed. "No, son. I'm not trying to scare you, but I want you to understand that we must respect places like this. We are guests, not masters." As they prepared for bed, Carlos suddenly asked, "What do they look like, Dad, the Nahuales?" Hector looked at his son, then out into the darkness beyond the campfire's glow. For a moment he thought he saw amber eyes reflecting the firelight from the forest edge, but when he blinked, they were gone. "They're like shadows made of dust and moonlight," he said. "Half human, half beast, but entirely of the land. And they have very ancient eyes, son. Eyes that have watched thousands of years pass by." They returned home on Sunday afternoon. When Hector opened his mailbox, he found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a simple handwritten note: "Las Aguilas needs your help. The mining company is expanding. Come on the full moon night." Hector felt the jade pendant heat up against his skin. He knew who M was, Miguel, the mysterious mechanic from that night. But how did he know Hector's address? And more importantly, why would the Nawales need help from an ordinary bus driver that night when the household was asleep? Hector stepped onto the balcony and looked up at the night sky. The moon was nearly full, just 2 nights away from completion. He had to make a decision. When he returned inside, Hector caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirror. In that moment, just a brief instant, he thought he saw something strange. His reflected eyes turned amber yellow, and something wild, something not entirely human, flashed across his face. Hector blinked and the image returned to normal, but he knew what he had seen. And he finally understood why the Nawales had helped him that night on the Mexico 81 route. They weren't just guardians, they were seekers. And they had found him. As Hector prepared for bed, he heard a light tap on his bedroom window. He pulled back the curtain and saw an eagle perched on the sill, a rare sight in this urban area. The eagle's eyes held an intelligence and awareness far beyond that of a normal animal. It tilted its head as if assessing Hector, then nodded almost imperceptibly. And in that moment, Hector felt something awaken within him, an ancient connection to the land his ancestors had called home, a heritage he hadn't known he possessed. "I will come," he whispered to the eagle, "on the full moon." The eagle spread its wings and flew away, disappearing into the night. But Hector knew this was just the beginning. The guardians were calling him, and he could not refuse the invitation. When Hector finally drifted to sleep, he dreamed of running through the forest on 4 legs, his silver-gray fur gleaming in the moonlight, and the call of Tepeolotl, the heart of the mountain, echoing in his mind. In the dream, Hector finally understood why he had always felt watched whenever he passed through that road. Not because he was being observed by the Nawales, but because he was one of them. The cross. When I first attended the National Autonomous University of Mexico, my bi-weekly bus rides home to Morelia became a ritual of transition between 2 worlds. Every other Friday night at 11:50 p.m., I'd climb aboard the Estrella de Oro night bus, settling into my window seat for the familiar journey. I made that trip countless times over 6 years, first as a high school boarding student, later as an archaeology undergraduate. Nothing remarkable ever happened until that final Friday of January. "Are you coming or not?" Elena's text flashed on my phone as I frantically stuffed my laptop into my backpack. It was 11:40 p.m. The last bus to Morelia would depart in 10 minutes. "On my way," I replied, scanning my cluttered rental room near campus. The place was a disaster, clothes everywhere, books piled high, empty pizza boxes from late-night study sessions. My 3rd year in the archaeology program was proving demanding, but I'd promised my mother I'd visit this weekend. I grabbed a few clean clothes, my toothbrush, and my old camera, a gift from my father before he passed away, then raced out the door. My apartment was normally a 15-minute walk from Central del Norte bus station, but with my heavy backpack, I decided to call a taxi. "To the bus station quickly," I told the driver, an older man with salt and pepper beard. "Night bus home, young man?" he asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Yes, the 11:50 to Morelia," I replied, eyes fixed on my e-ticket. "Morelia," the driver mused, taking a shortcut. "Monarch butterfly country, beautiful." I nodded absently. I'd traveled between Mexico City and Morelia every 2 weeks for nearly 6 years. Initially, my mother had objected to her only son leaving home, but the opportunity for a full scholarship at UNAM, one of Latin America's best universities, was too good to pass up. The 300-kilometer journey had become part of my life. I knew every curve, every stop, even the regular vendors at rest areas. The overnight bus journey was so routine that I rarely thought about it, typically using the time to catch up on sleep homework or watch downloaded movies. But this journey would be different, unlike any trip I'd ever experienced. The taxi stopped outside the bus terminal at exactly 11:45. I hurriedly paid, adding a generous tip, then ran inside. The terminal was nearly deserted, most ticket counters closed, just a few stragglers and security guards patrolling. I quickly located my departure gate for the Estrella de Oro night bus to Morelia. I sighed with relief, seeing the bus still there, a few passengers queuing to board. I scanned my e-ticket and stepped onto the departure platform. Elena stood there, arms crossed, her beautiful face wearing an expression of mild irritation. "Always cutting it close, aren't you?" She shook her head but couldn't hide her smile. "Sorry," I shrugged. The Maya civilization essay took longer than expected. Elena was my childhood friend from Morelia, also studying at UNAM in the pharmacy department. We often traveled together on our bi-weekly hometown trips. "There's something weird going on," Elena said as we approached the bus. "Some woman is causing trouble with the driver. She's carrying something large and bulky, and the driver wants to put it in the luggage compartment." I looked toward the bus. Indeed, a middle-aged woman appeared to be arguing with the driver, a tall man wearing the Estrella de Oro company jacket. The woman clutched a long object wrapped in white cloth. "What is that?" I asked curiously. "I don't know." Elena shrugged. "But she's insisting on bringing it on board." As we got closer, I could hear the argument. "Senora, I understand, but the regulations are very clear," the driver explained with visibly thinning patience. "Large items must go in the luggage compartment." "No," the woman protested, her voice trembling with emotion. "I cannot let it out of my sight. It's too valuable." I observed the woman more carefully. She was perhaps in her 50s, with black hair tied back neatly, her gaunt face marked with deep lines around the eyes and mouth. Her clothing, a long black skirt and thick woolen cardigan, seemed outdated but well-maintained. The woman clutched the white-wrapped object tightly. Looking closer, I could make out its shape, a cross. A rather large cross, approximately 1.5 meters tall. "Is that a cross?" I whispered to Elena. "Looks like it," she replied. "Extremely weird." A man wearing a blue vest, clearly a station supervisor, was approaching the disagreement. He spoke quietly with the driver. They exchanged hushed words. Then the driver nodded reluctantly. "All right, Senora," the driver finally said. "You may bring it on board, but you must place it in the back row, and you must ensure it doesn't disturb other passengers." The woman's face brightened. "Thank you. Thank you so much. God bless you." Elena and I exchanged glances as the woman hurried onto the bus, carefully maneuvering the wrapped cross. It was now 11:55, and we also boarded. Inside the bus was quite full, but fortunately 2 adjacent seats remained available in the 10th row. I let Elena take the window seat. She always enjoyed watching the night landscape while I sat in the aisle seat. The woman with the cross had settled in the very last row, placing the white-wrapped object against the seat back, eerily illuminated by the dim light from the emergency exit. At exactly midnight, the bus departed. The cabin lights dimmed, and some passengers immediately reclined their seats to sleep. I pulled out my earphones, planning to listen to music for a while before napping, but I couldn't stop thinking about the strange woman and her cross. "Do you think it's just a regular cross?" I whispered to Elena. "Who knows?" She shrugged, already yawning sleepily. "Maybe it's a family heirloom, or maybe she's just a religious fanatic." I nodded, but remained unsatisfied with that explanation. Something about the way the woman had clutched the cross, the desperation in her voice when pleading to keep it with her. It evoked an uneasiness I couldn't articulate. The bus had now left the city and begun its long journey on the highway. Elena dozed off within minutes, her head resting against the window, her breathing steady. I put on my earphones and selected a favorite playlist, gazing occasionally at the dark landscape outside. About an hour and a half into the journey, I dozed off into a light sleep, dreaming of Maya pyramids, ancient carvings, and dark corridors. In my dream, I was exploring an abandoned temple, my flashlight illuminating stone walls with strange symbols. And at the end of the corridor stood a tall cross covered in white cloth. I jerked awake when the bus stopped in Toluca, our first scheduled stop. I checked my watch, 1:30 a.m. I'd been asleep for about an hour and a half. The driver announced over the intercom that we'd stop for 20 minutes so passengers could use restrooms or purchase snacks. But unusually, nobody got off. Everyone seemed to be sleeping soundly, including Elena beside me. I felt my throat dry and decided to get off to buy water. As I walked down the aisle between seats, I couldn't help glancing toward the back of the bus where the woman with the cross had been sitting. Her seat was empty. The cross was still there, wrapped in white cloth, but no sign of the woman and of the... I shrugged. Perhaps she too had stepped off the bus to use the restroom. Outside, the Toluca bus station was nearly deserted at this hour. Only a small convenience store remained open, harsh fluorescent lighting creating an island of brightness in the darkness. I bought a bottle of water, took a long drink, and decided to use the bathroom before returning. When I returned, the driver was counting passengers. I was the last one to board, and he closed the door immediately behind me. Walking back to my seat, I noticed the woman with the cross still hadn't returned. "Wait," I said to the driver. "There was a woman sitting at the back. She hasn't come back." The driver frowned. "I've counted all passengers already, young man." "But her cross is still there." I pointed toward the rear of the bus. The driver looked in the direction I indicated, then shrugged. "Nobody got off. All passengers are accounted for." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. How could that be? I clearly remembered the empty seat when I walked past. I returned to my seat feeling confused. Elena was still sleeping peacefully, her head against the window. I settled back, trying to make sense of what was happening. About 15 minutes after leaving Toluca, I heard a sound from the back of the bus, a rustling of cloth followed by a soft sigh. I turned to look, but in the cabin's darkness I couldn't see clearly to the back of the bus. "Strange," I whispered to myself, turning back to face forward. And then the rustling sound came again, louder, this time closer. I turned quickly once more, and this time I saw movement, a dark figure moving between the seats from the back of the bus toward the front. My heart began beating faster. Someone was walking down the aisle, moving quietly and slowly. The woman with the cross, I wondered. But why would she be creeping around in darkness? The dark figure stopped at a row about 5 seats behind mine, then appeared to be examining something. In the dim glow from the emergency path lights, I could see it was indeed the woman. She was bending down, looking at the foot space of a sleeping couple. I watched amazed as the woman moved from row to row, seemingly searching for something. Her face in the shadows appeared tense and worried. Finally, she came to my and Elena's row. I quickly closed my eyes, pretending to sleep, but peered through my eyelashes. The woman stopped beside my seat, bending down very low. I could feel her breath strangely cold on my face. She was staring intently at the space between my seat and Elena's, as if searching for something that might have fallen there. I held my breath, trying not to move. There was something about this woman that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Perhaps it was the way she moved, too smooth, too silent. Or perhaps it was the look in her eyes, too focused, too intense. After a moment that seemed to last forever, the woman straightened up and continued toward the front of the bus. I watched as she reached the stairs leading to the lower level of the bus, then turned back and looked directly at me. And in that dim light, I could see her face had changed. It looked older, more gaunt, with a desperation I hadn't noticed before. She knew I was watching. The woman disappeared down the stairs, and I felt my heart pounding violently in my chest. I nudged Elena awake, gently shaking her shoulder. "Elena," I whispered. "Elena, wake up." Elena grumbled, slowly opening her eyes. "What is it?" "The woman with the cross," I said quickly. "She's searching for something. She just walked past here." Elena looked at me, her expression still sleepy. "What are you talking about?" "The woman who brought the cross onto the bus," I explained, trying to keep my voice calm. "She just walked through here, checking under every seat as if looking for something." Elena frowned. "Daniel, are you sure you weren't dreaming? I didn't hear anything." "I wasn't dreaming," I insisted. "She was just here, and now she's gone downstairs. Look, her cross is still back there." I pointed to the back of the bus where the white-wrapped cross still rested against the seat back, ghostly in the dim light. Elena looked in the direction I pointed, then back at me. "Maybe she just went to the bathroom." "No," I shook my head. "Something's not right. She was searching for something and..." I stopped when I heard a noise from the back of the bus, a heavy thud followed by the rustling of cloth. Daniel and Elena looked toward the back of the bus. The woman from earlier and a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, were bent over, apparently picking something up from the floor. "See?" I whispered. "Something's happening." Elena reluctantly nodded. "All right, let's go see. Let's go." We stood and began walking toward the back of the bus. As we approached, I could see more clearly what was happening. The cross had fallen from the seat onto the floor. The wrapping had loosened, and a corner of the cross was exposed. "Need any help?" I asked quietly, not wanting to disturb other passengers. The older woman looked up, her face pale in the dim light. "No, thank you. We can manage." But I couldn't help looking at the exposed corner of the cross. It wasn't wood or metal as I'd expected. It was something white, smooth, and curved, a bone. I drew a sharp breath, trying to maintain composure. That's bone, isn't it?" The woman quickly pulled the cloth back over it, but too late. I had seen it, and from Elena's expression she had too. "This isn't your business," the woman said, her voice hardening. "Please return to your seat." "But," I began. "Please," the younger woman pleaded. "We won't harm anyone. Just leave us alone." I felt Elena tug at my sleeve. "Let's go," she whispered. But before we could turn away, a mysterious man appeared from the shadows behind us. He was taller than I remembered, and his eyes, now I could see clearly, were completely black without whites. "Young man," the man said, his voice deep, like it came from a cave, "you should return to your seat. This is not a matter you want to involve yourself in." I stood frozen, unable to move. Elena seemed similarly paralyzed, her eyes wide with terror. "Who are you?" I finally managed. The man smiled a smile too wide for a human face. "I am the guardian, and you are interfering with what doesn't belong to you." The older woman stood up, her face now filled with fear. "Miguel," she said, addressing the man, "you are not permitted here. We have the cross." The man, Miguel, turned to look at her, his smile still present. "The cross has been compromised, Isabel. It has no power anymore, and I have waited a very long time for this moment." I felt Elena squeeze my hand tightly. We should run. We should return to our seats or go to the driver or do anything to get away from this situation. But before we could move, the man Miguel reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out. A brown rope. The rope the young woman had described as binding the cross. "Looking for this, Isabel?" Miguel asked, his voice mocking. "This is the last thing keeping your boy tethered to this world." The older woman, Isabel, drew in a fearful breath. "Please," she begged. "Don't." Miguel laughed derisively, and in that moment his face distorted, elongating, twisting, no longer human. "Too late," he said, and with a decisive motion he snapped the rope. A roar erupted from the white-wrapped cross, shaking the entire bus. The wrapping began vibrating as if something inside was trying to escape. Daniel and Elena stood paralyzed, too terrified to move. Other passengers on the bus began waking up, looking around in confusion and concern. "What's happening?" someone asked loudly. "Someone's screaming back there," another said. The cabin lights came on, and the driver announced over the intercom that they would stop to check the situation. But Miguel, or whatever possessed his form, seemed unconcerned with the reactions around him. He focused entirely on Isabel and the vibrating cross. "After all these years," Miguel said, his voice now deeper, more distorted, "you still thought you could keep him from me, that a few bones and prayers could protect his soul." Isabel knelt beside the cross, embracing it with both arms. "My grandson deserves to rest in peace," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "You have no claim to his soul." "Claim?" Miguel laughed harshly. "I have every claim. He sold his soul to me. A bargain is a bargain." I felt Elena pull my arm, tugging me backward. "We need to go," she whispered. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding before me. The young woman now stood fully awake beside her grandmother, fear evident on her face. "Grandmother," she said, "what should we do?" Isabel didn't answer. Instead, she began mumbling something, a prayer, I realized. She was praying in ancient Latin. Miguel frowned, the smile disappearing from his distorted face. "Don't waste your time, Isabel. Your prayers have no effect when the cross is broken." But Isabel continued praying, her voice growing louder and more confident. The young woman also began mumbling along, both hands placed on the tattered wrapping. The bus began slowing down. Clearly, the driver was finding a safe place to stop. But I didn't think we'd have time. Because at that moment the cloth wrapping the cross suddenly tore open and a skeletal hand emerged, an actual hand made of bone without flesh. Elena screamed, and I couldn't blame her. I wanted to scream too, but my throat constricted in fear. The skeletal hand moved, twisted, and gradually an entire skeletal arm emerged from the wrapping. Then a shoulder, a skull, and finally a complete skeleton stood upright about the height of a 14, 15-year-old boy. Passengers on the bus began screaming and pushing toward the front, trying to escape this horrific sight. But Daniel, Elena, Isabel, and the young woman remained as if frozen in time. "Carlos," Isabel whispered, her voice full of love and pain. "My grandson." The skeleton. Carlos turned its skull toward her, then toward the young woman as if recognizing them. But then it turned toward Miguel, and a terrible hissing sound emanated from its jawbone. Miguel didn't back away. Instead, he stepped forward, his face now completely transformed into something inhuman. "Carlos," he said, his voice sounding like 1,000 voices at once, "it's time to pay your debt." The skeleton trembled as if struggling to stand. Isabel and the young woman continued mumbling prayers, hands placed on the tattered wrapping. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run to escape this madness, but another part, perhaps the more curious or courageous part, wanted to stay and see what would happen. Miguel reached out toward the skeleton. "Come to me, Carlos. It's time to fulfill our bargain." The skeleton wavered as if resisting an invisible pulling force. It turned toward Isabel and the young woman, and a sound came from its jawbone, not a hiss this time, but a whisper, almost a plea. "Grandmother, Anna, help me." Isabel stepped forward, placing herself between Miguel and her grandson's skeleton. "You cannot take my grandson's soul," she said, her voice full of determination. "That bargain is no longer valid." Miguel laughed, a deep and terrifying sound. "And why not? Because he died. Death doesn't nullify a bargain with me, Isabel. He agreed, and his soul belongs to me." "It wasn't free choice," Isabel protested. "He was just a child. You deceived him." "A bargain is a bargain," Miguel repeated. "And now, with the cross broken, nothing can prevent me from taking what's mine." I looked from Miguel to Isabel, then to the skeleton of Carlos. I began to understand what was happening. Carlos, presumably Isabel's grandson, had somehow made a deal with something, a demon, an evil spirit, and now, after his death, Isabel was trying to protect his soul with a cross made from his own bones. "I know them," Elena suddenly whispered, her voice trembling. "Carlos, he went to my school in Morelia. He died 2 years ago in a motorcycle accident. People said he was running away from something." I looked at Elena, shocked. "You knew him?" Elena nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "He was a good kid. But there were rumors that he got involved in something dark, some ritual." Miguel, still advancing toward the skeleton, suddenly turned to look at Elena. "Oh, the girl knows much," he said, the demonic smile returning to his distorted face. "Indeed, dear Carlos participated in a ritual to save his mother from cancer, and I granted that wish. But every miracle has its price." Isabel shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "His mother still died. Your miracle did nothing." "I never said she would live." Miguel shrugged. "I only said she would no longer suffer. And that's true, isn't it? The dead don't suffer." I felt anger rising within me. The injustice, the deception, the cruelty of it all. A desperate child, a deceptive demon, and now a trapped soul. "Don't listen to him," I suddenly said loudly, stepping up beside Isabel. "A bargain made under deception is not a valid bargain." Miguel turned to look at me, surprise evident on his distorted face. "And who are you to speak to me of validity, boy?" "I'm an archaeology student," I said, my voice steadier than my actual feelings. "I know about ancient rituals, about bargains with otherworldly forces, and I know that a bargain made under deception has no binding power." Miguel stared at me for a long moment, then began to laugh, a deep and terrible sound. "Archaeology. How interesting. You think a few readings in textbooks can help you understand the laws of the other world?" But I didn't back down. I had read enough about ancient cultures and their beliefs to know that most mythologies shared one common thread: deception always undermined a bargain. "I know enough to say you have no claim on Carlos's soul," I said. "And I know that if we unite against you, you lose power." Miguel stopped laughing, his expression turning serious. "You're playing with fire, boy. You don't know what you're facing." "I know exactly what I'm facing," I said, despite my heart pounding violently in my chest. "A deceiver, a predator who takes advantage of others' desperation." Isabel looked at me with surprise and gratitude. The young woman, Anna, I now knew her name, did too. And the skeleton of Carlos seemed to stand a bit straighter, as if strengthened by my words. Miguel roared in anger, a sound no longer remotely human. "Enough, I will take what's mine, and after that I will take your soul too, archaeology boy." He lunged forward, his hand extending like claws, aiming directly at me. But before he could reach me, the skeleton of Carlos jumped between us, bony arms spread wide as if protecting me. Miguel halted, clearly surprised. "You dare defy me, Carlos, after all I've done for you?" The skeleton said nothing, but its posture spoke volumes. It would not let Miguel touch me, Isabel, or Anna. Isabel stepped forward to stand beside her grandson's skeleton. "Carlos is not alone," she said, "and you have no power here anymore." Anna also stepped forward, standing on the other side of the skeleton. "My brother made a mistake," she said, and I realized Carlos wasn't Isabel's grandson, but grandson, he was Anna's brother. "But we won't let him pay for all eternity." Elena, not to be outdone, also stepped forward to stand beside me. "Carlos was my friend," she said, "and I won't let him go like this." Miguel looked from one person to another, his distorted face contorting with rage, and was that fear, I wondered? "You think you can stand against me?" Miguel roared. "I have existed for thousands of years. I have taken thousands of souls." "And today you will take no more," Isabel said, her voice full of determination. She took from her pocket a rosary and began reciting another prayer. Anna also began praying, her voice joining her grandmother's. Elena, though not knowing the prayer, still mumbled along, doing her best. And I, inspired by their courage, also began to pray, not with the Catholic prayer I didn't know, but with a mental plea for protection and justice. Miguel backed away, his distorted face contorting in pain. "Stop!" he shouted. "Stop at once!" But they didn't stop. Instead, they continued praying, their voices growing stronger and more unified. The skeleton of Carlos, as if strengthened by their prayers, advanced toward Miguel, bony hands reaching out. "No!" Miguel screamed, retreating further. "You belong to me, Carlos. Your soul belongs to me." The skeleton didn't respond, just continued advancing toward Miguel. And as it moved, a light began glowing from within it, a warm golden light shining through the gaps between the bones. Miguel, now backed against the bus window, looked around frantically as if seeking escape. But there was no escape. The bus had stopped at the roadside, and they were in the middle of a desolate area with nothing but fields and distant hills. "You cannot do this," he howled, his voice increasingly distorted and inhuman. "A bargain is a bargain." "A bargain made under deception is not a valid bargain," I repeated, my voice more confident this time. And with those words, the skeleton of Carlos placed its bony hands on Miguel's shoulders. A terrible screeching sound emanated from Miguel as his body began smoking and disintegrating, as if being burned from the inside. "No!" Miguel gave one final scream before his body completely collapsed into a pile of ash on the bus floor. Silence fell over the bus. The skeleton of Carlos stood there, the golden light still emanating from within it, illuminating the space around. "Carlos," Isabel said, tears streaming down her face. "It's over. You're free now." The skeleton turned to face her, and for a moment I thought I saw the transparent outline of a teenage boy superimposed over the bones, a visual echo of who Carlos had been. "Thank you, grandmother." The skeleton whispered, its voice an ethereal echo. It turned to Anna. "Sister, you've grown up." Anna smiled through her tears. 2 years, brother. I've waited to see you again for 2 years. The skeleton turned to Elena. "Elena, my classmate. Thank you for not forgetting me." Elena nodded, too emotional to speak. Finally, the skeleton turned to me. "And you. I don't even know you, but you stood up for me." I swallowed hard, feeling a lump in my throat. "It was the right thing to do," I said simply. The skeleton Carlos seemed to nod. "A bargain made under deception is not a valid bargain." He repeated my words. "You were right. I didn't understand that until I heard you say it." Isabel placed a hand on Carlos's skeletal shoulder. "Grandson, now you are free. You can continue your journey." "Journey?" I asked. "To the afterlife," Isabel explained. "To where departed souls belong. Carlos has been trapped between worlds since his death, bound by the bargain with that evil one. That's why I preserved his bones, made them into a cross to protect his soul until we could break the bargain." "How did you know what to do?" Elena asked. Isabel smiled sadly. "I consulted a curandero, a traditional healer. He told me that the bones of the deceased can protect their soul, but only when preserved with respect and blessed. The cross was the most powerful shape, a symbol of sacrifice and redemption." I nodded, understanding. I had studied similar customs in ancient cultures, using the bones of loved ones to protect the living, to maintain contact with the departed. "Grandmother," Carlos said, his voice seeming weaker, "I feel it, the passage, I can see the light." Isabel smiled through her tears. "Go, grandson, go and find peace." The skeleton turned away, embracing the cross wrappings, and began to fade. With each passing second, the bones became more transparent until, after about a minute, they had completely vanished, leaving only the scattered cloths and loose bones on the floor. "He's gone," Isabel whispered, both sadness and relief in her voice. "Finally, he's gone. He's—" As the bus driver and a few brave passengers cautiously approached, I realized that the nightmare was over. Carlos had found peace, and the evil entity that had tried to claim his soul was defeated. But later that night, as we continued our journey to Morelia, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. About deals with supernatural entities, about souls trapped between worlds, and about the thin line separating our everyday reality from forces we barely understand. When we finally arrived in Morelia, I made a silent promise to research more about these ancient beliefs, to better understand the hidden world that had briefly revealed itself to us that night. And to always read the fine print before making any kind of bargain in this world or any other. I never told anyone else about what happened on that night bus. Who would believe me? But whenever I see a cross now, especially in cemeteries or roadside memorials, I wonder, what souls are they protecting? And from what? Perhaps some questions are better left unanswered. But if there's one thing I learned that night, it's that there are forces beyond our understanding constantly at work in our world. Forces that some can see and others cannot. Forces that sometimes we accidentally invite into our lives. The next time you travel on a night bus, take a careful look at your fellow passengers. And if someone boards with an unusually shaped package wrapped in white cloth, find another bus, the luggage. The dashboard clock read 10:58 p.m. when Javier Dominguez's bus engine roared to life. At precisely 11:00 p.m. he would close the doors and depart, not a minute earlier, not a minute later. 15 years driving for Aguila Dorada bus lines had instilled in him a religious devotion to punctuality, alongside his meticulous pre-journey vehicle inspections and unfailingly professional demeanor with passengers. In all those years, Javier had never been involved in a serious accident. At 45 years old, with salt and pepper temples contrasting against his otherwise dark hair, Javier's deep brown eyes conveyed the alertness and vigilance essential to his profession. His wife Sophia often joked that he maintained the bus more diligently than their own home. Perhaps she was right. He spent 12 hours daily in this vehicle, and it had become an extension of himself. The overnight route from Mexico City to Guadalajara was Javier's most familiar journey, nearly 600 kilometers, taking about 7 hours with 4 rest stops along the way. He'd traveled this route hundreds of times, could mentally map every curve, gas station, and even pothole along the way. Javier reviewed the passenger list one final time. Tonight the bus carried 43 people, nearly at capacity. December always brought peak season, with many returning to their hometowns for Christmas and New Year's reunions. He noticed several families with young children, a few student groups, and several business travelers. Final check, Javier murmured to himself habitually. He mentally ran through his pre-departure list: fuel, full tire pressure, optimal weather forecast, clear light fog expected after midnight road conditions, no reported accidents or construction. At exactly 11:00 p.m., Javier closed the doors and engaged the engine. The familiar rumble of the powerful Volvo diesel always brought him comfort. He adjusted his mirrors, verified once more that all passengers were seated with seat belts fastened, then slowly guided the bus out of the terminal. The automatic terminal gates opened, and the double-decker bus rolled onto Mexico City's streets. Javier navigated carefully through the still-crowded suburban avenues, then turned onto the northwest highway that would take them to Guadalajara. Inside, passengers were settling in. Some pulled light blankets over themselves, preparing for sleep. Others still stowed their carry-on luggage in the overhead compartments. A few children remained excited, chattering about their journey, but most passengers shared a single desire: sufficient sleep before arriving early the next morning. Javier activated the air conditioning at a gentle setting. December nights in Mexico could be quite cold, especially in the highland regions they would traverse. He adjusted the temperature to ensure it wasn't too cold but cool enough for comfortable sleeping. Within 40 minutes, the bus had completely exited the urban area and begun its journey on the highway. Ahead lay a straight 200-kilometer stretch before their first rest stop. Javier relaxed slightly, adjusting his sitting position for greater comfort. Tonight promised a smooth, uneventful journey, exactly as he preferred. The highway at this hour was nearly deserted. Occasionally a truck would pass or a few cars speed by, but mostly Javier's bus was the only vehicle on the road. A sense of peaceful solitude enveloped him as he drove through fields and hills shrouded in darkness. The faint moonlight cast ethereal shadows across the landscape. Mexico's clear night sky displayed millions of stars, a spectacle city dwellers rarely appreciated. Most passengers had fallen asleep by now. Soft snoring blended with the steady engine rumble and the sound of tires on pavement, creating a familiar soundtrack for these overnight journeys. Javier turned on the radio at low-volume tuning to a station playing boleros, his favorite music genre for night drives. The warm voice of Javier Solis filled the cabin, singing of love and longing. In the next 10 minutes, they would begin climbing into the highlands with steeper curves and reduced visibility. Javier reduced speed slightly in preparation, simultaneously checking the engine temperature gauge. Everything remained entirely normal. The bus headlights cut through the darkness like a bright blade, illuminating the road ahead. To the left and right stretched empty fields with dark hills silhouetted against the star-studded sky. What a peaceful night, Javier thought, allowing himself to relax marginally. But as an experienced driver, he never completely lowered his guard. On Mexican highways, especially at night, anything could happen. What Javier didn't know was that tonight something would indeed happen. Something beyond all his driving experience. Something that would forever change how he viewed night journeys, darkness, and what might lurk within it. As the bus began climbing into the highlands, the temperature inside the cabin dropped noticeably. Javier adjusted the climate control but still felt coldness seeping into the vehicle. This was normal in Mexico's highland regions at night, where temperatures could drop below 5 degrees Celsius in winter. The road ahead grew more challenging, consecutive curves, steep ascents and descents, and reduced visibility as fog began appearing in certain areas. Javier focused entirely on driving, reducing speed on sharp curves and paying close attention to road signs. The dashboard clock showed 12:20 a.m. They'd been traveling about an hour and a half and everything was proceeding smoothly. Javier calculated they would reach their first rest stop around 2:00 a.m., where passengers could use restrooms, purchase snacks, and enjoy a hot coffee. Suddenly, in his headlights, Javier spotted a figure by the roadside ahead. Squinting, he tried to see more clearly. It was a woman, and she appeared to be pushing a baby stroller. "What the hell?" Javier muttered, astonished. They were on a highway at least 30 kilometers from the nearest settlement. How could a woman with a baby stroller possibly be here at midnight? As they drew closer, the headlights clearly illuminated the woman. She wore a yellow blouse with an open back and jeans, entirely inappropriate clothing for the freezing temperature. Her long black hair blew in the wind, partially obscuring her face. Javier reduced speed, uncertain what to do. Company regulations prohibited picking up hitchhikers, but this seemed like an emergency situation. A woman and possibly an infant stranded on an empty highway in the freezing night. They clearly needed help. While contemplating his options, the unthinkable happened. The woman suddenly turned and, with a forceful motion, pushed the baby stroller directly into the bus's path. Javier panicked, hitting the brakes and swerving to avoid impact, but the large bus couldn't change direction quickly enough. He knew a sudden hard brake might cause the bus to skid or even flip over, endangering all passengers. "My God!" Javier exclaimed, gripping the steering wheel tightly, eyes wide with horror. Whether or not the stroller contained a baby, a collision would be catastrophic. In the final moment before impact, Javier instinctively hunched down and closed his eyes, simultaneously raising his legs slightly, an involuntary bodily reaction to imminent danger. But no impact sound came, no sensation of collision, nothing at all. Javier opened his eyes, still clutching the steering wheel. The bus continued moving steadily on the road. He glanced in the rearview mirror, searching for any sign of an accident behind them, but saw nothing. No woman, no baby stroller. "What the hell?" Javier whispered, cold sweat trickling down his spine. He gradually reduced speed and pulled over to the shoulder, activating the hazard lights. He needed to check. Perhaps he had dozed off momentarily. Or maybe the light had played tricks with his vision, but he needed to be certain nobody was injured. He stood up, intending to step off the bus to investigate, but just then he heard a sound, an infant's cry. The crying came from behind him, from inside the bus. Javier whirled around, his heart racing chaotically. That sound was unmistakable, the piercing wail of a newborn cutting through the quiet atmosphere of the sleeping bus. But there was no baby on board. He had checked the passenger list. He had seen every person boarding. No family had brought an infant. The crying sounded again, clearer this time. Javier felt goosebumps spreading across his body. The sound seemed to come from the rear of the bus, possibly from the upper deck or the luggage compartment below. A few passengers stirred in their sleep, but most remained deeply asleep. Perhaps the crying wasn't loud enough to wake them. Javier decided to investigate. He turned on the cabin lights at their lowest setting, sufficient to see his way without disturbing passengers. He slowly walked down the aisle between seats, carefully observing each seat, each passenger. No sign of any infant. The crying had stopped, and Javier began wondering if he was hallucinating. The stress of work, the long driving hours, and the monotony of the highway sometimes cause such strange phenomena. He returned to the driver's seat, deciding to continue the journey. Perhaps he needed coffee when they reached the next rest stop. Javier turned off the hazard lights, checked the road, and guided the bus back onto the highway. He tried concentrating on driving, pushing the strange thoughts from his mind. But he couldn't stop thinking about the woman and the baby stroller, and about the crying he'd heard. 2 hours passed without further incidents. Javier had almost convinced himself it was all due to fatigue and imagination. As they approached their first scheduled rest stop, a small gas station with a 24-hour restaurant and bathrooms, he sighed with relief. A brief rest, a hot coffee, and perhaps conversation with others would help him feel better. At exactly 3:00 a.m., the bus stopped at the rest area. Javier announced over the intercom that they would stop for 15 minutes for restroom breaks or snack purchases. Passengers gradually awakened, some disembarking, others choosing to remain aboard and continue sleeping. As Javier stood beside the bus smoking a cigarette to calm his nerves, he heard tapping on the window glass. He turned to see a woman, a passenger, signaling to him from outside. "What's wrong, miss?" he asked, approaching. The woman pointed toward the underside of the bus at the luggage compartment area. "I think something's wrong with the wheel, or, I don't know, something down there." Javier frowned, feeling concerned. He had inspected the bus before departure and everything had been normal. But perhaps they had hit something on the road that he hadn't noticed. "I'll check," he said, following the woman to the area she indicated. The woman pointed to the underside of the bus. "There, it sounds like something, I don't know. It sounds strange." Javier knelt down, trying to look beneath the bus. But nothing appeared unusual. He stood and walked around the vehicle, checking the tires and external components. Everything seemed fine. "I don't see any problem," he told the woman. "No, not there," she said, shaking her head. "In the luggage compartment, I heard a strange sound." Javier felt an icy chill run down his spine. He slowly walked to the luggage compartment door and opened it. Inside were suitcases, bags, and various luggage belonging to the passengers. Everything appeared normal. "I need to get my suitcase," the woman suddenly said. "It's at the very back." Javier nodded and began climbing into the luggage compartment to retrieve the suitcase she indicated. He had to crawl on hands and knees, careful not to disturb other luggage. When he reached the suitcase at the rear, suddenly he heard an infant's cry. The crying came from right inside the luggage compartment surrounding him. Javier froze. His heart pounded so violently he could hear it in his ears. The crying sounded again, this time clearer, closer, and then a bone-chilling sensation enveloped him as the light in the luggage compartment suddenly went out. The heavy clank of the luggage compartment door slamming shut echoed, trapping Javier in complete darkness. "Hey!" he shouted, scrambling toward the door. "Open up! I'm still in here!" He banged hard on the compartment door, hoping someone would hear. But his pounding was drowned out by the sound of a truck engine starting nearby. "Help!" Javier continued shouting, banging harder against the metal door. Initially careful not to disturb the luggage, now in his desperation, he no longer cared. He kicked forcefully, creating the loudest noise possible, hoping someone would hear. During his struggle, his foot struck something hard and circular in shape. A wheel. A baby stroller wheel. Javier froze, his entire body numb with fear. He reached out in the darkness, touching the object again to confirm. Indeed, it was a baby stroller right in the luggage compartment among the suitcases and bags. The crying sounded again, this time right beside him, emanating from the stroller. Javier wanted to scream, but his throat constricted with fear. He tried backing away from the stroller, but the luggage compartment was too confined. Just then he remembered there was a way to open the luggage compartment from inside, a safety mechanism for emergencies. He just needed to stay calm and find the lever. With trembling hands, Javier fumbled in the darkness, trying to locate the emergency lever. He knew it was somewhere near the door, but in the darkness and with his panicked mind, everything seemed to have changed position. The crying grew louder, seemingly moving closer to him. Javier had the sensation something was moving in the darkness, approaching him. Finally, his finger touched a metal lever. This was it, the emergency lever. He pulled the lever hard, and the compartment door sprang open, light flooding in. Javier hastily crawled out, nearly falling to the ground. He rolled over, then quickly stood up, breathing heavily. A few passengers were looking at him with concern and confusion. "Are you okay?" a man asked, stepping closer. Javier didn't answer. He turned back to look into the still open luggage compartment. There was no baby stroller, no crying sounds, just suitcases and bags neatly arranged as he had loaded them. "Who closed the door?" Javier finally asked, his voice trembling. The man looked at him strangely. "Nobody did. I just came from the restroom and saw you climbing into the luggage compartment. Then I heard banging and shouting from you." Javier looked around, searching for the woman who had asked him to retrieve her suitcase, but she was nowhere to be seen. He couldn't even remember her face, couldn't remember what she was wearing, as if she had been just a shadow, an illusion. "Is everyone back on the bus?" Javier asked, trying to regain his composure and professional demeanor. "Yes, I think so," the man replied. "They're waiting for you." Javier nodded, closing the luggage compartment with a firm slam. He didn't want to look inside again. He didn't want to think about the baby stroller or the crying. He returned to the driver's seat, his hands still trembling slightly. The passengers had returned to their seats, some looking at him curiously, perhaps wondering why their driver looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Javier started the engine, trying to focus on the task at hand. But in his mind, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had just experienced, about the mysterious woman by the roadside, about the disappearing baby stroller, about the crying in the luggage compartment, and about the reality that he would have to open that luggage compartment 3 more times before this journey ended. Dawn was breaking as the bus approached Guadalajara's outskirts. The first light of the new day reflected off distant high-rise buildings, creating an almost surreal scene after a long night of terror. Javier hadn't slept at all. He sat rigidly in the front passenger seat, wide-eyed, his mind constantly replaying the woman, the baby, and the luggage compartment incident. The elderly man drove skillfully and calmly. He had tried conversing with Javier several times, perhaps, to help distract him, but Javier only answered briefly. He dared not share what he had experienced. As they passed the "Welcome to Guadalajara" sign, Javier felt a slight relief. They were nearly there. This bizarre night journey was almost over, but then he remembered the luggage compartment. He would have to open it to retrieve luggage for passengers, and if what little Lucia had said was true, something or someone was waiting for him in there. "Are you all right?" the elderly man asked, glancing at Javier. "You look extremely pale." I'm fine," Javier said, though he knew he was far from fine. "Just a long night." The man nodded, not pressing further. Perhaps he had driven buses long enough to know that night journeys on highways sometimes brought strange experiences. The bus entered the city, passing through streets growing increasingly busy as Guadalajara awakened. Cyclists, street vendors setting up stalls, workers heading to early shifts, all signs of normal life, a world Javier felt he had left behind long ago. Finally, the bus arrived at the terminal. The elderly man parked in the designated spot, turned off the engine, and turned to Javier. "We've arrived," he said. "Safe and on time." Javier nodded, offering a small thanks. He stood up, wobbling slightly from exhaustion and stress, then took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, striving to maintain a professional tone, "we have arrived in Guadalajara. Please check your personal items and be careful when exiting. I will open the luggage compartment to retrieve checked baggage." Passengers began standing, collecting belongings, and moving toward the exit. A few cast concerned glances at Javier, perhaps still remembering his strange driving incident the night before. But most were too busy preparing to disembark to notice. Javier allowed the elderly man to assist passengers off the bus while he prepared to open the luggage compartment. He stood before the compartment door, his hand on the handle, but couldn't bring himself to open it. "Do you need help?" the elderly man asked, approaching Javier after most passengers had disembarked. Javier shook his head. "No, I can manage." He took a deep breath. "But could you stay here with me? I don't want to open it alone." The man looked at him strangely, but nodded. "All right, I'll stay." With the man's presence beside him, Javier found courage to unlock the luggage compartment. The click sounded as the lock released and the door slowly raised upward. Javier held his breath, half expecting, half fearing to see a baby stroller or worse, an infant. But when the compartment fully opened, all he saw was passengers' luggage neatly arranged as he had loaded them at the journey's start. No baby stroller, no infant, nothing unusual. Javier sighed with relief, feeling as if a stone had been lifted from his chest. Perhaps it had all been hallucinations caused by fatigue. Perhaps he had imagined everything. He began removing luggage, placing items on the ground for passengers to identify and collect. The elderly man helped him, and the two worked in silence. When they had nearly removed all luggage, Javier reached deep into the compartment to retrieve a suitcase in the far corner. His hand touched something soft and warm. Javier froze. Slowly, he withdrew his hand, his eyes widening in horror. "What's wrong?" the elderly man asked, noticing the change in Javier's expression. "There's something in there." Javier whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. "In the far corner." "What do you mean?" The elderly man looked puzzled. He bent down to peer into the luggage compartment. "I don't see anything, just a few suitcases left." "No, there's something," Javier insisted, but then stopped. Perhaps this man couldn't see what Javier saw, just as passengers couldn't see the woman in the yellow blouse. "Let me get it out," Javier said, finding courage. He knew he had to do something. Had to end this. He reached into the compartment again toward the far corner where he had felt something. This time his hand touched a small, soft object like a toy. Javier pulled it out and saw what he was holding, a small doll with blonde hair wearing a white dress. Its eyes were closed as if sleeping. "Did someone forget a toy?" the elderly man called to the remaining passengers gathered around. No one claimed it. Most passengers had already collected their luggage and left. Only a few remained waiting for the last suitcases. "Strange," the man said, shrugging. "Perhaps we can leave it in the lost and found." Javier nodded absently but couldn't take his eyes off the doll. There was something about it, something familiar. As he turned the doll in his hands, he noticed small lettering embroidered on the back of its dress. Maria, December 8, 2020. A name and a date. Was this a birth date or perhaps... Suddenly, Javier realized what it was. August 12, 2020. That was the date he had been involved in an accident. An accident he never spoke about, not even to Sophia. It had been a rainy night. He was driving a bus on this same route. Visibility was poor, the road slippery, and there had been a small car that cut across his path. He had tried to avoid it, but it was too late. The bus had collided with the car. No bus passengers were injured, and the car driver suffered only minor injuries. But afterward, as police were taking statements, Javier had heard a woman screaming the woman from the car. "My child, my daughter, where is she?" The child, a little girl named Maria, had been thrown from the car during the accident. They had searched all night but couldn't find her. Days later, they declared she had died, possibly swept away by rainwater into a nearby canal. But they never found the body. Javier had thought about that accident for months, but gradually the pain had faded, and he had continued with his life. He had been declared innocent. It was an accident, not his fault, but the guilt never completely disappeared. And now this doll, with the name and date. "Are you all right?" the elderly man asked, shaking Javier's shoulder. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Javier couldn't respond. He just stared at the doll, feeling as if the world was spinning around him. Suddenly he felt an icy breath on the back of his neck. He slowly turned around and saw the woman in the yellow blouse standing there looking at him with eyes red from crying. "Maria," the woman whispered, her eyes fixed on the doll in Javier's hands. "My daughter." Javier didn't scream this time. He didn't run away. Instead, he felt a profound sadness and guilt washing over him. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. I I didn't know." The woman moved closer, and this time Javier felt no fear, only sadness and regret. "My daughter," the woman repeated, extending her hand toward the doll. Javier nodded and gave her the doll. "She was in the luggage compartment," he said. "I don't know how. I don't understand." The woman cradled the doll against her chest, as if it were her actual child. "She's been there since that night," she said, her voice echoing as if from somewhere distant. "She's been trying to find her way back to me." Javier felt tears welling up. "I didn't know," he repeated. "I swear I didn't know." The woman looked at him, and for the first time there was a bit of understanding in her red-rimmed eyes. "I know," she said. "It wasn't your fault, but now I've found my daughter, and we can rest." She turned to walk away, holding the doll, and with each step her form became fainter, until after just a few meters she had completely vanished. "Who were you talking to?" the elderly man asked, looking at Javier with concern. Javier turned, realizing the man couldn't see the woman, just as he couldn't see the doll that had vanished from Javier's hands. "No one," Javier said, wiping his tears. "Just a memory." The man didn't ask further, perhaps assuming Javier was overly tired or stressed. They retrieved the remaining suitcases and closed the luggage compartment. Javier felt a strange relief, as if an invisible burden had been lifted from his shoulders. "Will you be all right?" the elderly man asked as they prepared to part ways. Javier nodded. "Yes, I'll be fine. Thank you for everything." The man smiled, patted Javier's shoulder, and walked away. Javier stood there for a moment, alone beside the empty bus. Dawn had fully broken, warm sunlight bathing the city. A new day had begun. He knew he would have to report to the company, explain about the driving incident and yielding the driver's seat to a passenger. He might get into trouble, but right now that didn't seem important. Javier took out his phone and called his wife. "Sophia," he said when she answered, her voice still sleepy. "I love you." "Javier, what's wrong?" "Nothing," he said, feeling a relieved smile forming on his lips. "I just wanted to hear your voice." He knew he would never forget the woman in the yellow blouse or the doll with the name Maria. He also wouldn't forget the infant's cry in the darkness or the sensation of the baby stroller under his hand. But perhaps, after all, this wasn't a ghost story. This was a story about forgiveness, about finding peace after the unavoidable tragedies of life. As Javier began walking toward the bus station to catch a ride home, he glanced back at the bus one final time. In the morning sunlight, it looked completely normal, nothing mysterious or frightening about it. But he knew that tonight, when the sun set and darkness enveloped the empty roads, another bus would roll along the Mexico City-Guadalajara route. And perhaps someone might see a woman in a yellow blouse standing by the roadside, but this time with a peaceful smile on her lips and a small child in her arms. As Javier walked away, he didn't see little Lucia standing beside her mother, watching him with a small, secret smile. And he didn't hear her whisper to her mother, "They're gone now, Mom. They found each other." Lucia's mother looked at her daughter with confusion, but didn't question her. There are things that only special eyes can see, and stories that only pure souls can understand. As for Javier, he would continue driving night buses. But from now on, whenever he opened a luggage compartment, he would always check carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for lost souls still trying to find their way home.